Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Sligo Central Library for this special edition of The Word. Welcome also to everyone joining us on Facebook. We are delighted to welcome Paul Little to Sligo Central Library to discuss his publication hot off the press, In the Shadow of Benbulben, Dixie Dean at Sligo Rovers. We are also delighted to have journalist Austin O'Callaghan and musician Stephen O'Dowd with us this evening. To the Sligo Rovers supporters here and joining us online, we're delighted to have you. This evening's event builds on Sligo Library's links to this wonderful story. In collaboration with Sligo Rovers History and Heritage Committee, Sligo County Library hosted a very successful launch of a Sligo Rovers exhibition in 2012. And this exhibition in Sligo County Museum saw record visitor numbers, which included family members of Dixie Dean. The Sligo Rovers 1937 League Champions banner is proudly on display in Sligo Museum, as well as some other items of memorabilia. Before the conversation begins, can I ask you to please mute your mobile phones and just to note the exits, the door behind you and the door here to my left. If you would like to be notified of similar events, you can leave your name at the library desk at the end of the event. Stephen O'Dowd is going to open the evening now with some music, and following the discussion, we will have a roving mic circulating for any questions from the audience. Enjoy the evening, everyone.
Wake up in the morning, love. The sunlight hurts my eyes. There's something without warning, love, bears heavy on my mind. But then I look at you, and the world's alright with me. Just one look at you, then I know it's gonna be a lovely day. A lovely day. The day that lies ahead of me seems impossible to face. Someone else instead of me always seems to know the way. But then I look at you, and the world's alright with me. Just one look at you, and then I know it's gonna be a lovely day. A lovely day. Lovely day. Lovely day.
Well, that was lovely, and I think it deserves a round of applause here at Sligo Central Library. Stephen O'Dowd, thank you very much. Sligo born and bred. I think he's still learning what the offside rule means in football, but he plays a mean guitar. Thank you, Stephen, for that, and we'll have more from Stephen a bit later on. Welcome to the Word, and welcome to Paul Little, author of In the Shadow of Benbulben. Welcome to Sligo, Paul, first of all.
Thank you, Austin, and thanks for having me.
I've read your book. I'm trying to work out if you have any Sligo connections. I'm not sure if you do. Who are you, first of all?
Well, just to say no Sligo connections that I'm aware of as to who I am. I hail from Dublin originally, but live in Wicklow for the last 20 years anyway, sorry, I lose count. And so, no links whatsoever. I was on holidays once in Enniscrone, and I was at a wedding here once. That's as much as it goes. A man across the road comes here on holidays. That's more or less the links to me and Sligo, apart from now this book. But no, I work I'm not even a full-time writer. This is the first book I've written, or the only book I've written. Maybe I'll write some more, please God. But just a story that had caught my fascination years and years ago. I have written for the Irish Daily Star, covered European football for them. I've worked a little bit with RTE and News Talk and others in the past. But mainly the bread and butter is actually working in web-based training and e-learning as an editor and writer there. So I suppose good kind of training perhaps for writing for putting together a book, but I suppose football is really what drew me to the whole thing, and then this particular story.
Okay, so you grew up with football?
Absolutely.
So, I mean, Dixie Dean meant something to you even as a young person?
I can't actually remember when I heard mention of this story. It has to have gone back about 20 years. And so it intrigued me. In terms of football, I'd say from the moment that I was conscious, I think football is what I remember most. I'd say my earliest memory is the 1977 Cup final and Liverpool against Manchester United, and feeling somehow aggrieved that Liverpool lost that as a 6-year-old. I'm not quite sure how that was even in my head. But since then, it's always been a kind of consuming passion. Largely, I must admit, the English game, but always the Irish game, the domestic game was of interest, but not with any particular passion for any particular club, but just always wishing that it would do better and that it would be more buoyant, which is actually something that we're seeing now, which is great.
In Sligo, we're very proud of our football club, Sligo Rovers FC, and we do like to brag about things that this club has done that not many other clubs have done, and getting a player like Dixie Dean was one of them. People locally have different versions of the story. How did it come across your radar, so to speak?
Well, I'm trying to remember how, and I can't quite put my finger on it. I know, I remember doing the first bit of research I did on it, going back, as I say, 20 years, when I should have been doing something else in work, and just the story I'd heard about it, and I started to try and read up on it. I thought that'd make a great book or a great long piece or whatever, but because I used to write kind of as a hobby, I suppose, and send pieces off, etc. But I can only ever find the same articles that came up time and again, perhaps with various kind of anniversaries or whatever else that might get mentioned. But it was as a story. I mean, the reason why I suppose the book came back to me there, if you remember back, probably going back about 10 years ago when Lionel Messi and Ronaldo were banging in goals at an incredible rate, and it just occurred to me that, and maybe even somebody had said it, that's kind of like at a Dixie Dean level. And I was thinking, well, God, Dixie Dean probably is, and I was thinking that Dixie Dean, and then he played for Sligo, and maybe it's worth looking more into that, as to what that was about. And at the time, I mean, I think a lot of people know there was a lot of different players came from England to play here over the years, and I would have been, I suppose, more aware back in the 80s of people like Terry McDermott or whatever else coming and playing a few games for clubs in Ireland, that kind of stuff. But the more I looked into this and realised he was here for half a season, and that there was a lot of drama in that, the more it occurred to me that there was probably something worth following up. But then life intervenes, Austin, and all that time was kind of lost 20 years still, more or less till the pandemic, I'd say, when suddenly I found the time to get back and look at it properly. Okay,
so this in a way was a pandemic product.
It is very much so, although as it happens, I had been writing for The Star, as I say, doing my day job, but I was writing a weekly column for The Star on European football. And I also then found myself coaching 2 soccer teams with my 2 sons, and it was finding it becoming more and more difficult week to week to produce for The Star, so I thought something had to give. So it was actually just before the pandemic that I had decided to take a step back from that position. However, I thought, well, maybe this is a good chance to start looking into this particular story. So I got myself some access to newspaper archives, etc., and started to read. And then the pandemic hit, and then suddenly everything else stopped, and suddenly there was time that I never had before.
Yeah. We're both too young to remember Dixie Dean in the flesh, obviously, but I was trying to explain it to my son who this guy was when I was telling him about this book that had been written about this Sligo Rovers story. And I suppose for younger generation, people who might be watching online this evening, or people here in the audience who are too young to remember him, One of Dixie Dean's big records was that he scored 60 league goals in a season in 1928, and that record still stands to this day. Today we eulogise that Mo Salah of Liverpool scored 32 goals in 2017, Alan Shearer and Andy Cole scored 35 goals. Nobody has got close to that title in a decade when footballs and pitches and the facilities were a lot more difficult to play football on than they are today.
Yeah, and that's what really struck me when I started to try and. It's not a great idea to compare players from different eras. It's very difficult to do. But I suppose what became apparent is that when you look into that, even that 60-goal season, that he's effectively scoring twice as many goals as Alan Shearer would have scored in 2 seasons. That's what he was doing. And so maybe it was something of a one-off, but then he continued to score at a huge rate after that as well. But that particular season was as I say, it's not been. Nobody's come close, and it's probably never be mastered, I would imagine, at this stage. But he was doing it at a time where you're playing in boots that are probably better suited to a construction site, and you're playing with a football that actually could potentially cause you serious damage. And he was able to somehow come through that time and rattle up a huge amount of goals. Again, on pitches as well, that particularly through the winter time, that were often unplayable. And that's even commented. I know Sligo's pitch, they're very proud of it now, but certainly back then when he was playing, it was a different, particularly through the winter, I would say it was a different surface, we put it that way.
So when you started writing, where did you find your information? Did it mean coming to Sligo? It was a lockdown period, pandemic, you were maybe limited. Was it Sligo Library, going through archives? Where did you go?
It was all online through the national newspaper archives, which you can get, and it's worth doing if you're ever interested in doing something like that, is just to pay the subscription. That's something that had put me off for several years, is do I actually want to pay a subscription like this? But I'm glad that I did. And so what I found initially was, I knew that he'd played 11 times and he'd scored 11 goals. I knew that much. I knew he'd been in a cup final. So it occurred to me to go back to start, find when did he sign, and then maybe take it match by match and see, was there match reports? I wasn't even aware what kind of match reports might be written at the time. So just by searching, I started to find that a lot of papers were covering it, but particularly the Sligo Champion was obviously covering it very closely at the time. But then the national papers in Ireland were covering it, and you got the odd report from English papers who were still keeping an eye on Dean at the time, which in itself is kind of amazing that they were still following his career even though he'd left England at that point.
So even back in the 1920s and 30s, there was a surprisingly decent amount of information available, more maybe than you thought at the beginning?
Yeah, well, when you think that at the time that, consuming soccer at the time, you were playing it or you were reading about it, you might have seen snippets maybe on a Pathé News if they even had that, but that's the only way you could see it. But the newspapers, and the Champion was actually interesting because at that time it was coming out on a Saturday, so the match reports, the games were played on Sundays, but they had a week more or less to write a match report. So on a Saturday, the report that you read was a week on and probably more considered than if it was immediately afterwards. So a lot of the Dublin papers would have been on the Monday, perhaps a match report, but the Champion had it on a Saturday. So Volt, who seemed to be the football reporter, which is a peculiar name, and as I found, that was another thing that was interesting, is that at the time, very few football reporters either had their names reported in the paper or had a byline at all, or if they did have a byline, it was a peculiar name like that, which my understanding is that for a long time, sport wasn't considered that important in terms of report. You could report it, but there was no necessity to name who was actually doing the reporting. And then sometimes this kind of pseudonym byline might have allowed them cover for the fact that maybe several people might have written the articles from week to week or the reports. But Volt's pieces week to week really gave a kind of an insight into the matches and into what was going on around the time as well. And as I looked into it, it was more than match reports. And there were a number of incidents that happened in that 4 months that kind of set it aside and made it kind of much more interesting. Because you might say, how do you thread together just 11 match reports? But there's actually a lot more going on at that time, as I found out.
Well, let's get into the book. I'm wondering, how would somebody like Dixie Dean, a revered footballer with Everton and England, football royalty across the Irish Sea, why would he come to the northwest of Ireland, to a town like Sligo? How did it happen?
Well, I think the question is probably still somewhat open, but what we know anyway for sure is that he had left Everton under a cloud in 1938. Now at that stage they were already looking perhaps to replace him, but he was still only 29, 30 at that stage. There was certainly through his career, because it was a pretty arduous career. There were injuries, etc. But he was still scoring a high rate even up to that point. But he moved on to Notts County. as I say, under a cloud, he'd fallen out with the Everton club secretary. And moved on to Notts County. There was a cut-off point in which he could sign for another club, and he wasn't in the first team, or he was in and out of it, that he kind of made the jump away. But then he got another nasty injury at Notts County and only played 9 games for them. And so effectively retired when he was 31. But then he moved in. There's not many jobs for footballers, no matter how great they were. And he literally was the first international football superstar. So that when he was, that season in 28 where he scored the 60 goals, Everton went on tour to Europe afterwards, and he was followed by crowds up and down streets wherever he went. And even that idea that where people they really couldn't have seen him play, but they knew who he was. There were cartoon strips and cigarette cards, etc. But obviously there was, his legend kind of travelled around with him. So in terms of coming to Ireland, there was no job once he'd left Everton. He had set up a sports shop in 1937 with a view perhaps to his retirement, but that failed quite quickly. So they say it was a difficult time. No matter how great you were, there was no punditry jobs. You weren't going to be there was no coaching staff necessarily going to take you on. So he actually moved into football scouting initially in the kind of Lancashire area. And that's how Sligo kind of came in touch. Now, there's more detail perhaps in the book about that, but essentially, come the winter of 1938, Sligo were more or less out of the league title race. Shamrock Rovers were too far ahead. But they knew there was big money to be made out of the FAI Cup, and so that was starting in February. So they were on the lookout for a centre forward to kind of drive that. They had a few contacts with Merseyside. Apparently there's a couple of priests who had some involvement in the whole story. But Dean was contacted and he was asked could he find them a centre forward for the second half of the season. He said about doing it, couldn't find anybody who wanted to make the switch over to here. Then he said, well, what about me? And I think that the Sligo Rovers committee more or less, I'd say they must have nearly fainted, I'd say, at the suggestion. Now, there was a gamble because he had been injured, but it seems that certainly he was feeling better than himself, I think, physically at that point, and he was only 32 at this stage. So, I suppose it was a test for him and a gamble for him to come and play. He needed the money. That's going to be the long and short of it. He still had to pay. He had a wife and 3 kids. He had to put a roof over their head and keep that there.
Were you able to glean how much he got for coming to Sligo Rovers?
No, not really. One of the things I suppose that stands out is that back at the time in England, there was a wage cap or a salary cap, so you could only earn £8 a week, even if you were one of the better players. There were certain amounts of bonuses on top of that, but that was what it was capped at. However, you could come to Ireland and earn more, potentially, if they could put together a package to get you. Because they didn't have, in Ireland, we weren't observing the same salary cap. So I'm not sure, and it wasn't apparent what he was getting paid, but it was clear that Sligo needed a number of benefactors to come on board to help pay his wages because they wouldn't be able to support themselves. And I know that he travelled back to England afterwards with a healthy, an envelope full of money to take him back home again, which he said himself was a very generous payment from any club at any time. So, but enough, I'd say, to pass it back home and keep his wife and his children there going while he's away.
So when the deal was agreed, Dixie Dean is coming to Sligo. I mean, in today's money, that's Ronaldo or Messi is coming to Sligo. I mean, did it cause a sensation on either side of the Irish Sea?
Well, it did on both sides, and I think even the English papers were commenting on it at the time because everybody had thought that he'd hung up his boots, and he was still a hugely kind of popular figure within English football and English culture at the time. So the suggestion that he was suddenly going to pop up playing again somewhere else, and the fact that he was in Ireland was of interest to people in England. And then in Ireland, I think people probably didn't necessarily quite believe that it would happen. And certainly had he gone, say, perhaps to Dublin, to Shamrock Rovers or Bohemians, it might have been more understandable to one of the big Dublin clubs. But in Sligo at the time, I know it's a lovely town, but it's not a metropolis. And back then it was only 13,000 people. So he was used to playing in front of 2 or 3 times that amount every week. And he was coming out here. And even to travel I travelled from Wicklow today, it's quite a trek up. So we can only imagine what it was like to come from Liverpool to Dublin and then get a train across. Yeah, it was a long old way.
This was January 1939. I'm going to get you to read an extract from your book in just a moment to take us to the train station here in Sligo on the day, or what at least a couple of thousand people in Sligo thought was the day that he was going to arrive in Sligo. Yeah,
so I'll read this. It's chapter 5. Dixie Dean arrives in Sligo. In the shadow of Benbulben mountain lies the town of Sligo, the town's train station and a gathering crowd. It's the morning of Friday, 27th of January 1939. Reports say there may have been as many as 2,000 people there to greet the greatest superstar ever to visit the town. It's incredible, really. In the 1930s, to consume soccer, you played it, went to watch it, or you read about it. Yes, perhaps you might have seen snippets of matches in the cinema or in Pathé News, but that's all they were, snippets. So for a man who many had probably at best just read about, to draw such a crowd on a bleak January West of Ireland morning speaks to the status of William Ralph Dixie Dean. So the people came in their droves. The club's hierarchy came, the Sligo champion came. Mayor Conlon, a member of the Sligo Rovers committee, came, and they waited. Doubtless many present were there because they didn't really believe. Probably came to snigger and giggle at the most outlandish news the town had ever heard. Others came because they wanted to believe, wanted to see their town on the map, wanted the excitement, the madness. And the train duly arrives, steaming slowly into the station as if deliberately building excitement and tension. And there is a swell of excitement as the passengers alight. Eyes strain, necks crane, the welcome is ready. But Dixie Dean does not come. William Ralph Dixie Dean is not on the morning train from Dublin. And one can only imagine the disappointment, the shock, as the train empties and the platform clears and the biggest star ever to come to Sligo doesn't in fact come to Sligo. Imagine how the club officials must have felt. Hearts in mouths. Had it been a ruse? Had they been set up? Were they going to look like fools? And the fans and the people. Sure, it could never happen. What on earth would football's greatest centre-forward be coming here for? Had everyone lost their heads? Perhaps the report in the Irish Independent the previous Tuesday, stating that Dean had only agreed to help find players for the club and that he had definitely declined to make a personal appearance was true after all. But then a phone call from Dublin and an update and an apology, and relief all round. Dixie Dean said he was coming, and Dixie Dean is coming, but on the later train. He'll be there at 6:40 p.m. Sincere apologies for the misunderstanding. The former Everton man had taken the opportunity while in Dublin to visit an old friend, the former coach of Bohemians FC and the former Evertonian Billy Lacey. Volt in the Sligo Champion reported on the player's eventual arrival in his soccer causerie column the following Saturday. While hundreds cheered a welcome to Dixie Dean at Sligo Station last Friday night, the famous centre-forward, tired yet smiling and happy, told me that the ovation he was receiving was just like an English Cup final. Immediately he stepped off the train, he was surrounded by vociferous men, women and children. Following his failure to arrive on the early morning train, there was a keen disappointment felt in the town, which was quickly banished when the evening train steamed into the accompaniment of exploding fog signals. Rarely, if ever before, did Sligo accord such a royal welcome to anybody. With difficulty, the hero of the hour was brought to the railway hotel, where he was introduced to members of the Rovers Management Committee. The Irish Independent reported on Dean's arrival in similarly excited fashion. Scenes of extraordinary enthusiasm were witnessed at Sligo railway station on the arrival from Dublin yesterday afternoon of the 6:40 train, which brought to the Sligo Rovers team the former English international centre-forward Dixie Dean. Over 2,000 people, representative of all classes in the town, thronged the platform. As the train steamed in, fog signals were exploded on the line and the crowd cheered vociferously. Dean was with difficulty escorted to the Great Southern Hotel, which adjoins the railway premises, and later went to the Café Cardo on Wine Street, outside of whose doors a dense mass of townspeople continued to wait for several hours for a glimpse of the famous footballer. In Dean's own account, the fog signals in his honour certainly left an impression, betraying perhaps a slight trepidation at being an Englishman in a country that had fought so long and so hard to escape the rule of London. They told me there was a big reception waiting for me there. When the train was a mile from Sligo, I heard 5 explosions. I looked across at the Sligo official and said, "These IRA blokes aren't very good shots, are they? They've missed me 5 times.
Very good. There's a little bit of humour there, which is nice too. And we think Dixie Dean stayed in the Café Cairo for a while above
so
the
in
cafe
the
on Wine Street in Sligo.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he obviously was a conscientious sort as well, that he made the apologetic phone call, "I'll be down on the evening train," etc. So how did he fit in then, Paul? And how did you convey that in the book?
Well, I suppose the first thing he had to do was fit in with the team, which was kind of the critical part for Sligo, clearly. And initially it seemed actually that his own teammates were quite overawed by him being in the team, and opposition players were more inspired than his teammates. It took a while for people to get onto his wavelength. But I mean, he, by all accounts, I talked to Melanie, his granddaughter, Melanie Prentice, and she was saying that he was very much a kind of a social man, and he was more than happy to get out and have a drink with whoever wanted to have a drink. I'd say he had plenty of time in his hands to do so. He was certainly a fan of the races and things like boxing, etc. So if there was anything event going like that, he was going to appear if he could. But I suppose football was the initial thing that he had to do, and he wasn't given much time. So he arrived on the Friday, he was playing on the Sunday, he was playing again the following Wednesday. So there wasn't an awful lot of time for initially to settle in. By that kind of Wednesday, they'd won the initial game, they'd lost the second game against Bray Unknowns in Shelbourne Park, and there were question marks in the media in Dublin about whether he was able for it at all. There was questions about his mobility. But one thing that was notable from that game, he got a crack in the head. He was taken off for treatment. He came back out afterwards, bandaged to play on and score. And I think that was probably for Sligo and for the committee. It showed that he wasn't there just purely to make appearances. He was actually going to dig in and try and play. And that made, that was a massive impact, I'd say, for them.
Yeah, because he had technically retired from English football, so there would have been those question marks.
Absolutely, and that followed all the way through the story, that, you can see a development, as I say, that the Sligo papers were, every time he played or touched the ball, it was, the most magical thing they'd seen. But the Dublin papers took a different view and questioned whether, there's no question about his ability. But could he get around the pitch? Could he, was the pace gone? What have you got left in the tank? Was he looking a little bit heavy? And he probably was. He hadn't played now for several months. But as the story progresses and the goals start to go in, but not just the goals, it's just the influence on games. And the more the players got used to playing with them, you could see the impact all the way through the rest of the season. But the other thing that he did, I think that's kind of that caught my eye at the time, and that I really liked, is that he was a keen golfer. He had kind of learnt the game back in Birkenhead. He'd spent his time, when he had a bit of free time as a child, going into the golf course and collecting golf balls. And he was actually, he was given a chance there to play a little bit. And he was one of these people, I'm sure we've all met these annoying people who are just good at everything. And he was a scratch golfer, as well as being a professional footballer. And he played a lot of golf in England. So when he got over to Sligo, he entered the West of Ireland Golf Championships, which I know is kind of a very prestigious amateur tournament here, and a lot of, we've even several major winners have won that. And he got through 3 rounds of that, and then went and played. He got knocked out on the Sunday morning and went and played for Sligo in the afternoon and scored again. So, that kind of, doing those kind of things, even at the golf, then there was a big gallery just following him around to see him play. So, that was kind of a fascinating thing. And the other thing that I really liked, 1,000 people turned up to watch him referee a football match up in Letterkenny. Wow. Where he had been injured. I think he'd actually picked up a knee injury playing golf, which nobody, I think they kind of kept that kind of quiet. But he was invited up for St. Patrick's Day. There was a match between a Donegal county selection. Donegal had no League of Ireland team at the time. And every once in a while there would be a kind of a county soccer match. And this was a challenge match between Sligo and Donegal, and they asked him would he ref the game, which he did. And as I say, 1,000 people turned up just to see him man the whistle. And then he gave a talk that night on modern football tactics, which again drew a massive crowd there to the town centre.
I can't imagine a match referee drawing the crowds today, Paul, to a game like that.
No, well, if Messi or Ronaldo came and refereed the match, who knows? I suppose you might. But it's even, again, I mean, everybody knows who they are. Everybody can see them anytime they want to see them. The very fact that people couldn't have seen him in real life, and I suppose if he was suddenly there doing things around the town, I suppose that was of massive interest. And you have one of the pictures in the book is a poster of he gave a lecture on football. Well, that's it. It was that night of the refereeing in Letterkenny. He then, as part of it, there was a dinner dance, etc. that night, and he was to give a talk on modern football tactics beforehand, which. I don't know whether Messi or Ronaldo will ever do that. But, I mean, I suppose the point, in a way, of the book is that the fact that he came here, he had to come because he was offered the opportunity and there was money there, obviously, which he had to make. But if he was playing now, I mean, he was such a superstar, there was no question he would never have come to Sligo. He wouldn't have needed to go. He might have, towards the end of career, say, well, I fancy playing in another country for the culture, or I'll finish up playing for LA Galaxy or something like that. But these were different times, and he had to come and play. There's no way that when Messi or Ronaldo hang up their boots that they'll be worrying about going to play for anybody at all. They don't have to do it. But he had to do it, and he came and he committed to it, which is the point. It's not like, we've all probably heard of, or maybe we haven't, there might be another book in it, but Bobby Charlton playing for Waterford, George Best playing down in Cork. But Bobby Charlton was 39 at the time, and it was pretty clear that it was a bit of a struggle. You wouldn't have expected him to have a major impact, but he definitely could draw a crowd. And George Best was well past his best, and it was more sad to see him play in Cork than inspirational. And they didn't last very long, whereas Dean played for 4 months, and he may well have. He intended to come back to Ireland, but Hitler intervened, so we never know what happened after that.
So in the 1939 season, Rovers were doing reasonably well in the league, and Dixie Dean arrives. Was his impact instant, or did it take time?
Well, it was an instant impact in as much as he drew the crowds immediately. So there was a record crowd at the showgrounds to see him. When they went to play, Bray very quickly in the second match were aware of the possibilities and moved that game, which had to be refixed from their Carlisle grounds up to the Shelbourne Park because they knew they could get a bigger crowd. But that was on a Wednesday afternoon in February. And these are the days pre-floodlights, pre-anything else. People were working. And they got a crowd of about 4,000 in, but they're not even sure if that was accurate because a lot of people got in for free because the gate was burst open to get in as well. So in terms of crowds, there was no question. And across the country, people were aware, so they knew that they could probably, certainly if he was playing, they were going to pull in the crowds. On the pitch, he scored in his debut, which was great, and he set up another goal. But as I say, there was question marks about necessarily whether he was as mobile or whether he'd be able to carry it through a season or through a number of games. Then he scored in his second game as well. So suddenly, clearly he's there. He came back on, as he scored with his head, covered in bandages. So he was going to, obviously he was committed to doing it. So yeah, there was an impact in both ways, and that carried on through the season. I suppose certainly in terms of crowds, when he was playing in England, if there was any question about him being injured, they tended not to tell anybody because they knew it would knock 5,000 or 6,000 off a crowd if he wasn't there. And that did happen in Ireland on 2 occasions. He was to play in Limerick. There's even a programme to show his name in the team sheet, but he was injured because of this golfing injury. But Limerick didn't let on that he wasn't playing. And then there was an incident with Drumcondra a few weeks later, where again, it was probably the only time that he actually wasn't received as well as he might have been. Sligo knew he couldn't play. They said they'd informed Drumcondra that he wasn't going to be playing, but Drumcondra said they tried to let people know there's a notice maybe outside the ground, but that's not necessarily going to be seen by everybody.
Yes.
I suppose you might say, how else could they have let anybody know he wasn't going to be there? So Talca Park was packed, huge crowd, and Dean came out and just in his civilian clothes and shook hands on the pitch before the match, and when the fans realised he wasn't playing, they weren't happy about it, and they let everybody know about that for sure. So it was the only time perhaps that he got booed in his time that he was here.
We have to remind ourselves there was no Twitter or Facebook to spread the word back in the day.
Exactly. It wasn't. Yeah, it was difficult for him to do it, but there's always a question as to whether anybody really tried to let anybody know that he wasn't going to play, because it definitely had an impact on your bottom line. Put it that way.
Yeah. You mentioned this was a calculated gamble by Sligo Rovers to bring Dixie Dean over here. They were hoping they would get some sort of dividend. And in your book, much of it stems around Sligo Rovers and the main cup competition here, the FAI Cup in 1939. Yeah,
because they, as it transpired, one of the best pieces that I found in research was, again, the Sligo champion had a report on the AGM of the club at the end of the season where they went through the facts and figures of the matter. And what became apparent, which they knew that if you could get a good cup run, particularly if you could get to Dairyman Park for the semi-final or final, if it was going to be played there, that you're talking to crowds, in excess of 30,000, and there was a lot of money to be made for the club in doing so. So that was the gamble. They knew that, if you could get that far, and it was only a couple of rounds to get there, that you could definitely that would be very good for the coffers. So, as I say, that's what they were aiming to do. And that's what they got, I suppose, without giving the whole story away, but I'm sure people are aware of it. But they made as much money in their, 4 or 5 FAI Cup matches that season as they did in the league, plus the Shield competition, which is a kind of, it was, back then there was a Shield competition in the league, and the Shield ran for the first, couple of months of the season where you just played against your opposition once, and then you played the league season after that. So in all of those combined matches, they made more money in 5 matches out of him being there. And
to illustrate that, Dixie Dean came after they played all their Shield games.
Yes.
So really, Dixie Dean, the 5 FAI Cup matches, earned almost as much money as all Rovers League and Shield matches put together.
Exactly, yeah. And they were out, apparently the first round cup game down in the Mardyke against Cork drew a crowd of 20,000 people to it. Or so the Birmingham Mail newspaper had reported, which shows again that in England they were still watching to see, and that's the kind of impact he could have.
And in relation to that, Paul, one thing I noticed you tried to do throughout the book is to put the facts and figures into today's money. So if there's gate receipts of 157 Old English pounds, that in today's money, you've done it obviously by economies of scale calculations, about €12,000 to give people a sense of what that would mean today.
Yeah, well, I won't go back into the calculations of all of that because they're quite complicated, but yeah, it involves the consumer price index and various other things going back. There is a calculator that you can find online to do it. But I felt it was important to try and give a sense of what it meant. You know, you see oftentimes when you read books like this and you see, oh, well, gate receipts of £120, and it really doesn't mean anything to you. You can't figure out what that is. So I tried at times as well where there wasn't actually a definite attendance that you could figure out because it was 2p for to get into a game, etc. You could figure out how many people were there. And so it was useful to do that. But I won't go into the mechanics of that necessarily.
No, not at all. And that's a backhanded compliment to you, because reading the book, it is a light read. And what I mean by that, we're passionate about football, and you can be anarchy about statistics and who did what, but actually the story is, it's a very accessible style you've done to tell Dixie Dean's story.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a short story, so I didn't want to labour the point. And necessarily look for another 30,000 words on top of what's there. I mean, he did only play 11 games. He was only here for 4 months. But a lot of things did happen around that time that make it interesting. As I said, just little small pieces. The golf obviously was kind of an interesting little snippet. The fact, I suppose, that AGM as well. And I suppose the one thing that the protests, which were in Sligo Rovers when they did reach the cup final, there was talk of switching the date from the Sunday to the Saturday to accommodate Shelbourne, who were the Dublin side they were playing against. And there was a mass meeting of 500 Sligo Rovers fans in the town with the mayor, and they threatened that if the game was switched to a Sunday, because they were a Sunday team back then, clubs played Saturdays or Sundays, I suppose depending on what, how their fans worked, how the team worked, because they weren't all professional. But Sligo were very definitely a Sunday team, and this was their first cup final. It had been agreed earlier in the season that the final would be on a Sunday, but because Shelbourne were looking for it to be switched to a Saturday, because their best player was a devout Presbyterian, and he wouldn't play on a Sunday, as they wanted to switch to a Saturday. So there was talk that might happen. So the Sligo fans came out in a massive protest of 500 people, and not only did they threaten to withdraw from the cup if this date was changed, that they were going to disband the club, which it's kind of bizarre that would be the case, that anybody would go so far. But they knew that if it had been switched to the Saturday, first of all, I mean, I think that the Sligo secretary had been saying that if they did, then all the provincial clubs could suffer that kind of problem in future, where the Dublin clubs got their own way, so they weren't going to have that happen. And they also knew that the fans couldn't go to the cup final, or a lot of them wouldn't be able to make it. But it was still quite a threat. And then just allied to that, it was a lot of letters to the newspapers of the time, with people, particularly in Dublin, writing about that particular incident and accusing the Sligo fans of being Hitler-like in their actions, which gives a sense of the time when this is all happening as well.
I mean,
so
this produced multiple letters to the editor across all the national press.
Yeah, which is a kind of an amazing story.
Who got their way?
Sligo got their way. But there's some question whether Shelbourne were ever going to do it in the first place. That was the other side of it. And so I think, there were still people saying that it wasn't really fair. What if Dixie Dean couldn't play on a particular day? Would Sligo be looking to move the day or whatever else? But I think in the end, I think Shelbourne, I mean, with Shelbourne playing in Dublin, there was no issue of their fans being able to go to the match. And so I think it was obviously that meant a lot more to the Sligo fans that they'd be able to go and see the game. Saturday or Sunday shouldn't make much difference to Shelbourne, so it was clear that it was really about a player rather than their fans in that instance. Whereas, for Sligo, this was a massive moment to go and play the first cup final.
When you were going through all your old match reports, did you ever get a sense that Dixie Dean came in for tougher treatment from opposition teams because he was the superstar from the English league, that
I think everybody
players or teams might have said to themselves, we'll sort this guy out?
I think everybody got sorted out in those days, and that's more or less the impression you get. It was a a very tough time physically for all players, and I'd say there's no question that at times when you read the match reports that maybe two players were put on Dean to try and keep him under some kind of control. But if you read back, and even particularly that 60-goal season, it became apparent that Dean was, he was well aware of that kind of, that was going to happen, and teams did that. But he was quite happy to take them on a dance around the pitch and take them away and create space for everybody else. And that's what struck me. He's a very unselfish player. The goals were a big part of it, but he still set up a lot of goals as a centre forward, and he did a lot of that for Sligo. But he was a very clever player, insightful player. So he was, I think everybody took physical, hits in the game. But he was kind of clever enough to be able to move himself out of positions. And he could take the hits as well. He certainly could. But I don't know whether he got any more special treatment. Sure. I think he was well able to deal with whoever was with him. But by his own understanding of the game and his reading of the game, he was able to kind of put that to Sligo's advantage. You have another extract marked there. Would you like to read it to us? Sure, yeah. So this is just a little bit about his debut and the lead up to it. It's Chapter 6, Debut, Questions to be Answered. For Sligo Rovers, spectacular coup though it was, the signing of Dixie Dean was nevertheless a gamble. Obviously, his recent injury-dogged seasons were a worry. Football fairy tales aside, the financial element of the story couldn't be ignored. Dean wasn't coming for free, and the club's committee needed him to do more than fill a train station, even if he did do it twice in one day. The club had pushed the boat out on this one. The opportunity could hardly have been passed up once it became clear that the player was interested in the move, but help was needed to fund the deal. According to Volt and the Sligo Champion, were it not for the wholehearted support of a number of citizens of the town who offered to become guarantors of Dixie's wages, the capture would not have been possible. Sligo's finances could not have borne the expense. With the help of the generous local benefactors, the club was hopeful that Dean's standing in the game would provide enough pulling power to cover any outlays and earn the club some money on top. A good second half of the season in both League and Cup would provide enough fixtures to capitalise on Dean's presence in the side, both in Sligo and wherever he lined out in their colours. The league was a long shot, but even if catching a smart Shamrock Rovers side was unlikely, the runners-up spot was still worth pursuing. After all, it would have represented the club's second-best league return in its short senior history, and a good run of league form would certainly help generate interest and lucrative attendances. And with the FAI Cup set to kick off in February, a trophy the club had yet to win, an exciting cup run wouldn't do the Coffers any harm at all, especially if the Bitter Red could make it to the semi-final and final, which historically had drawn large attendances and very decent returns. Ultimately, the more games Dean played, the more the turnstiles would click home and away. Sunday, 29 January 1939, and the league clash with Shelbourne would be the first test of Dean's pulling power and the first chance to assess just what he had left in the tank. What would happen if he was but a pale shadow of the legend? What if the injuries really had seriously reduced his mobility? What if the ease with which Notts County had let him go truly was a red flag Sligo Rovers shouldn't have ignored? What if the decision to retire only months earlier had actually been the correct one after a long, arduous career? For all involved in the club, the excitement of signing Dean must have been laced with such fears. Sunday and Shelbourne would tell much. Dean had backed himself to do a job for the club, and Rovers were committed to it now, one way or the other. Interest was high, and a large crowd was expected at the showgrounds for the 3:15 kick-off against the visiting Dubliners. But if Sligo star signing's legs were gone and his ability to play football had gone with them, then just how long would interest be maintained? For Dixie's debut, however, his attendance alone was always going to be enough to draw a large crowd. After all, international celebrities weren't exactly a common phenomenon in the town and surrounding areas, despite the chance meeting of Dean and the great tenor Jack Feeney the previous Friday evening, which was, in turn, a highly unusual alignment of stars. Just to say, Jack Feeney was from Swinford. He was a Mayo man, but he was a kind of a very famous, he'd made it big in America as a famous tenor. And by pure chance, the day that Dean arrived, they were both in the hotel together and they met, and neither knew who the other was, but they were aware that they were both very famous, and certainly the town was too. But even if Dean were to simply walk out onto the showgrounds pitch and amble around for the afternoon, that might well be enough for some to say they saw him on a football pitch in Sligo's red. Happily for the club and its fans, however, and despite showing an understandable level of rustiness, Dixie gave those who had paid good money to see him a taste of what he was all about as a player and the promise of more. The road to the ground was jammed with a crowd and cars, reported the following day's Irish press, with number plates indicating trips having been made from the remotest parts of the country. And on top of those who had made their own way to the ground, many spectators were bussed in from as far west as Westport in County Mayo and as far north as Derry, as the curious and the starstruck joined the club's regular and irregular supporters to witness Dean's debut. Indeed, a record league crowd for the Bitter Red was packed into Sligo's humble ground, with gate receipts of £157, as reported in the local paper, to see the fabled striker make his first appearance for the Bitter Red. Cue much rubbing of hands from the Sligo committee. So far, so good. They had got the desired effect off the pitch, but how would Dean perform on the field of play? That was the question.
Thank you, Paul, for that. We will give some of our audience here in Sligo Central Library an opportunity to ask you a question or two in a short while. Do you get a sense from reading about him, studying him, that he liked Sligo?
Well, we know he did, and that came from in reading about it. There's two books, which is kind of bizarre when you think nowadays most football players have a book for when they reach 22 or 23, and then there's probably another book when they get to their late 20s and then beyond. But Dean had nothing written about him really until 1980 when an author, Nick Walsh, wrote an autobiography. And in that, which is where that's one of the first places I looked, I found this particular book, which is kind of sad in many ways because the book hadn't been taken out of Limerick Library since 1996. And so I think I was the first person to get it in that time, which is kind of, in a way, what feeds into the story, because it's such a brilliant story, and it's sad that even Dean himself, who's a massive figure, I thought that everybody knew who he was, and they clearly don't, which is why I wrote about the 60-goal season, just to give that, that context. But that he's kind of drifting from people's kind of memory and will eventually kind of fade, and this story then itself will disappear as well. But we know from that book, there's a couple of pages where he mentions Sligo, and effectively what he had said in it was that it was one of his most enjoyable times in football. And I'd say it probably wasn't just because he was away from the wife and kids for 4 months, but he actually did enjoy being here. He was well looked after. Obviously, the welcome was brilliant. He enjoyed the football. And I'd say, given that he had retired and probably thought this was the end, to have another chance, I'd say, and then for it to go well and for it to be received as he was, I'd say it did mean a lot to him. And then, just to give a sense of where he went from there, because when he travelled back to England just as the war began, his next job was in an abattoir. He had hoped to come back to Ireland, but it never happened. But it gives you a sense of the lot of a footballer, even the greatest there ever was at the time, that when he went back to England, there was no work for him. He was waiting perhaps to get drafted into the army, so his first job was in the local abattoir in Birkenhead. So that's quite a come down. I don't think that Messi and Ronaldo have to worry about such situation.
From the showgrounds to the abattoir,
Yeah.
the glamour.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely. Paul, thank you. We're going to take a little break for a piece of music, and we will invite some of our audience if they'd like to ask a question or two to Paul Little, author of In the Shadow of Benbulben, Dixie Dean at Sligo Rovers. So Stephen O'Dowd, we'll hand over to you.
Almost heaven, west side of Sligo, home Rovers. I support them when they play. Deadly mighty Rovers, and see them play at the old Churchill Road to the place I belong. That's the showground. Sligo Rovers, take me on to road. Remember when I was younger, now the Rovers. Take me up to the place I belong. That's the showgrounds. Sligo Rovers, take me on the road. I love to hear the crowd, especially after scoring. We all come together just to hit and play. I hear that song is fine, and hear us say, take me up, country. Take me up, Churchill Road, to the place I belong. That's the showground. Churchill
Stephen, thank you for that. The modified lyrics, courtesy of well-known Sligo Rovers supporter Graham Monaghan, taking the old John Denver classic and bringing Churchill Road, the road that the showgrounds is on, into it there. We do have a roving mic, I think, here at Sligo Central Library. So if there is anybody here in the audience who'd like to ask Paul a question, you can put your hand up and we'll make the mic to you. While we're waiting for any volunteers, Paul, did Rovers try and keep him a bit longer, or was this always going to be a short-term partnership at the showgrounds?
Well, they were interested in keeping him, and he was interested in staying, or at least staying in Ireland anyway. What tended to happen with players at the time is that they would be, essentially clubs could hold their registration to some extent and try and make a transfer fee out of them if they could. Sligo were holding on to him on their reserve list, as it was called. But they could make money from him. But I think what happened was that because war effectively broke out, that Dean decided he had to go home and wanted to go home. And so he had talked about coming back. There was interviews at the time that he might look to get back to a League of Ireland team, but I'd say nobody knew at the time how long I suppose the war was going to go on for, so it just never happened. But at the same time, Sligo were interesting because they'd done so well out of the deal. There were suggestions that they were in England looking for a replacement anyway, if he didn't come back. And there was talk, which seems kind of bizarre now that it could happen, but that they were interested in Ted Drake, who was Arsenal's, superstar centre forward, and that you initially kind of said that just couldn't be possible. But it was reported in the Belfast Telegraph, and they were suggesting that clubs in Northern Ireland should be doing the same as Sligo and looking to go and buy these kind of players. The sense was that they'd made so much money from it that they could entice one of England's top current players to come and play. Now the Arsenal themselves and their hierarchy said that they didn't know anything about it. But it is true that they were over there looking for players. But the very fact that people believed that they could sign somebody of that ilk, it showed, I suppose, that people believed that Sligo made a lot of money out of it. And they did make good money out of it. I don't think it was ever likely they were going to be signing another player of that kind of quality who was still probably at the peak of his form. But it's bizarre. You certainly wouldn't imagine now, you'll never hear of an Irish club looking to sign maybe one of the top players from England. It's just not really likely to happen.
I think it'd be difficult to all right, yeah. Would anybody like to ask a question to Paul? We have one down here, yeah.
Hi, Paul.
Oh, yeah.
Great listening to you this evening. I actually have three questions. The first one was, what was the score of the game he reffed up in Letterkenny? The second question was, we know we got 11 goals in 11 games. How many assists did he get? And third, final question is, what was the biggest attendance during his time here in Sligo?
Well, there's three there that are very tricky.
You're on your
I think certainly the scoreline up in Letterkenny was a very heavy win for Sligo. I can't quite well. I think they banged in 7 goals, maybe to 1 or 7-2, something like that. In terms of the biggest crowds here in Sligo, that isn't apparent or doesn't come through in terms of the gate receipts they report. So I can't really give you an answer on that. I know that certainly the cup final in Dublin was a record crowd at the time, and actually the replay, without giving it all away, certainly for a midweek match was a huge crowd. And even then, the game they played against Bray in Shelbourne Park at the time was a record crowd for a midweek game, played at whatever 2 or 3 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon. But sorry, I don't have all of those facts. They're difficult to dish out, but I can understand that's probably for another book or another day, and maybe more research on those.
We'll get you on the table quiz team. Maybe.
Yeah.
Yes, we'll do that. Thank you for those questions. Anybody else like to ask a question? We have one. It's Mal there, I think.
Hi, Paul.
Hey.
I was just wondering, as the book is out now and you've been in Sligo and you've been in touch with Heritage Group and Rovers themselves, what have you learned yourself about Sligo Rovers you mightn't have known, or the fan base before?
Well, I knew that they were a community-run club. I think one of the things that always kind of interested me, even growing up in terms of the League of Ireland, was the provincial clubs and the crowds that they could bring. So you would always be hoping, because I was, as I say, when I was growing up, the one thing I always wanted was not necessarily any particular club to be great, was that I wish that in Ireland you could go to a match and you'd have a similar crowd, or you'd have a huge crowd the way you have in England that you could see every week. And what struck me, any time that there was a cup final, which is most often what I got brought to as a child, didn't matter who was playing, is that if it was one of the provincial sides, that you were hoping it would be, because it was more likely to bring a crowd. Even if the game was in Dalymount, you couldn't guarantee a big crowd with two Dublin sides. But certainly, and that's been borne out now in even more recent years, the size of the crowds that are growing, particularly for cup finals. But I think, what really struck me, we were made very welcome there the other week at the showgrounds, and it's just, the fact that all the jobs people are doing, all the commitment of different people to sell programs, to open the gate, to run the turnstiles, just to actually see it all in action and to be introduced to so many people who are doing that kind of stuff. One of the reasons for the book for me was to write something about the League of Ireland and its history, because there's very little written at all. And there may be good commercial reasons for that, as I'm about to find out, I'd say, but it nevertheless, like, it's 100 years old, and the clubs have survived, so many of them, for so long, through incredibly difficult times, and times when people were completely dismissive of it, and even to a large extent people are now. But there's so many people who've kept it alive all the way through in lots of different clubs, not just Sligo Rovers. So it was as much to kind of pay tribute to people who've been involved in the league for so long, who've kept things going. And you can see that in Sligo, which, travelling here and being to a match, you can see how central it is to the town, and how important it is to people, and how many people get involved. And I think that you don't necessarily see that, or maybe, in Dublin, because it's such a big city, you don't have the same sense when you go to the grounds. And that's not to say it's not like that, but I don't know the people there, I haven't seen it. I do go to Bray, and you see volunteers, and you see people who work, and it's, often with very little reward, So I think I learned, how important that is, and it's something even in recent years. I grew up watching Liverpool and supporting Liverpool and big time football in England, etc., like so many people. But your 15 euros that you pay into a League of Ireland ground actually makes an impact to the club, a definite impact. Whereas the 60 euros or 70 you might pay for a jersey from Liverpool, they don't even know you bought it. They don't. It means nothing to them. You're just another number. So you can see how, and I prefer if it was that way, if people actually had that kind of sense around their clubs. And it's a shame. As I say, from Wicklow, I feel, Bray work very, very hard. But I don't think people realise how lucky they are to have a League of Ireland team in their county. Not every county has a League of Ireland team. It's very precarious. It could disappear. It could be gone anytime. And so it'd be great if people started to see it that way. And I think people are seeing it a bit more now. I think that's the other thing I've learned, I suppose, through the passage of writing it. And when we talk about tough times, the league was just starting to lift when the pandemic hit. So I think one of the last big matches on the telly at the time was Shamrock Rovers against Dundalk, and there was a full house. And it was, you so rarely see a full house in League of Ireland, and we were seeing with Bohemians, etc. And then the pandemic hits, so I thought, oh God, that's going to kill clubs off. It's going to be so difficult. But since we've come back, people seem to be coming back, I suppose, to watch the games. And I'm not sure why. From my own perspective, it's because I've got 4 children, and I always wanted to take them to football, but I ain't taking them I can't afford to take them to England to watch a match, and I'm not going to pick one and say you're coming and the others aren't. But you can go to Bray and they can get in for free or for £5 in, and they get to see football. And say, sure, it's the same here. And I think maybe there's a bit of a movement of people who maybe of my age who are finding there's room for both. And I think for too long people have been kind of dismissive of one and saying, well, it's it's small time, it's not worth my time. But actually, you can quite easily go and watch a League of Ireland match and then go home at the weekend and watch your Sky Sports if you want to. And maybe more people are realising that. And there's another element to it as well. I think the way I see English football now, much as I love it, is that it's like watching Dallas when you're younger. That's what English football is like, or Dynasty, whereas the League of Ireland is a bit more kind of kitchen sink. And there is room for both. But, English football has become even more pantomime now in a way, and big time football. And so it's almost like you can watch it, but you don't have to take it that seriously. So it's almost flipped for me, almost. Whereas when you go and see a match and you can feel, the effect on the people who are just even working there and putting their time in. And maybe people are starting to see that. I hope they are anyway.
I can see a bit of red shirt on you and your kids already, Paul. Thank you, Malachy, for that question. One final thought just to finish, Paul. And you mentioned you spoke with Dixie Dean's granddaughter, Melanie Prentice. She and the Dean family, to this day, retain a decent connection with Sligo. They're very proud of what their granddad did here and the affection that he had for the place.
Yeah, and Melanie works in the Dixie Dean Hotel, which is a recent kind of addition to Merseyside. They're kind of pushing a football quarter, as I understand it, in the city, and so there's a Shankly Hotel across the road from the Dean Hotel. And they're obviously trying to draw in, I suppose, football fans, etc. So she has an interest in keeping any story alive in relation to him, but obviously she's very proud of him, and she was very close to him. She grew up with him for a long period, so she knew him inside and out, I suppose, as a child. And so she would have heard a lot about these stories. I think, I suppose she's proud of the links, as you say, and the fact that people are still interested. It's 90 years, 80 years since he was here. But the story obviously still has an impact here, and I suppose that has an impact on her and her family. And they're very much behind this book. And Melanie very kindly wrote a foreword for me for the book as well, which is great. And her husband, David Prentice, I'm sure, who's here as well, who was late of the Liverpool Echo. He was their Everton writer for 30 odd years or whatever. Now he's moved into he's director of communications now at Everton itself, and he's been very supportive of the book as well. And so it means a lot to them, and it's nice that it can carry so long. And I think that's the reason, in a way, for me writing the book, that it is a story that endures. It's kind of an intriguing story. I don't know why anybody wouldn't be interested in it. I didn't write it for Sligo Rovers fans. I wrote it because I liked the story and I thought it was worth writing about. I didn't write it for Everton fans either. I'm not an Everton fan, but the story itself is, if you like football, you don't see stories like that often. And so it's definitely worth kind of retelling.
Well, you did say somebody should write a book about Dixie Dean at Sligo Rovers. Paul Little, we're glad that you did. In the Shadow of Benbulben. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Little.
Thank you.
Open flames burn my shins, I'm alive again. There's porter aplenty. Hold my hand, there's a place in my palm for you. You're cold and it's empty. We sing so fondly of cedar. Blood moon drains away, becomes so pale in the depth of the night. Drifts away, rolls across the night sky. Out of sight, the birth of the light wakes upon us. 'Cause there's a garden of memories, and golden leaves swing gently over, the circles running on the ground, makes a crown neath where you stand. All around you, hawthorn blooms and the laneways dressed, all in in the Mayflower. Watch your hands, feel the pink and white, and understand now is an hour to keep on your mind. Before one, water slips away through your hands, likewise does the daylight. In your mind's eye, hold it tight with you and bring it through a winter's night until spring. 'Cause there's a garden of memories, and golden leaves swing gently over the circles running on the ground, makes a crown beneath where you stand. Blades of grass will cut your feet, so be it, stinging so sweetly.
No doubt for that lovely music and the guitar playing, which brought so much to the evening. And thanks to Paul Little and Austin O'Callaghan for a really illuminating conversation and bringing the story to life that so many Sligo Rovers supporters have held in their hearts for so long. And I'm also pleased to see a Dublin-born League of Ireland supporter who only said provincial twice during the whole evening. So thanks very much. Paul is going to be signing copies and has copies available here the evening, and all I can say is best of luck to the real Rovers for the rest of the league, and good night everyone, and thank you.